All right, everyone, let's get started. Now, as you guys all know, I tend to speak extremely slowly during lecture. And today, because we're getting started late because of technical problems, I'm gonna have to speak a little faster than usual. I'm really sorry. Very quickly, there's an announcement. The exams will be returned next week in section. And some students in the class asked me to make an announcement that an organization called Developers for Development is co-hosting a panel discussion about successes and failures of mobile health tonight at 7 to 9 o'clock in Tickner Lounge, and there will be in Boylston Hall, and there'll be free pizza and a chance to network for future opportunities. All right, so since we're getting started late, I'm just going to try to speak really fast to catch up, if you don't mind. Now, what does it mean when we say that one thing is the cause of another thing? For example, we might say, and this is an old question, of course, in philosophy, and it's one that even Aristotle considered very, very early on. And he conceived of causes as being of four different types: the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. And by material cause, he meant that out of which a thing comes to be. For example, bronze or silver that is used to make a sword, for example, or ornament. And the formal cause is the statement of essence, or the account of what is to be. The efficient cause is the primary source of change, for example, a man who gives advice, or a parent of a child. And the final cause is the end, that for the sake of which a thing is done. For example, health is the cause of exercise. Or if you were thinking about a table, and you were thinking, what is the cause of a table? Wood is what the table is made out of. Having four legs and a flat top is what it is to be a table. A carpenter is what produces a table, and eating on and writing on is what a table is for. And so when we think of the causes, and in fact it turns out we can think of the causes of death in an analogous way, begin to revisit what we think of as the causes of death, because we can think of them in terms of whether they are the formal causes. What's the cause of death? The formal causes, the disease itself, or the efficient causes, let's say the risk factors that place you at risk of death. So here once again is our familiar causes of death listing in the United States. And on the left, the usual way we think of these diseases gives you, the distribution of the top 10 killers in the United States. But on the right, we could reconfigure the causes of death to be composed of these risk factors. So now we see like tobacco, diet and activity, alcohol, microbial agents, toxic agents, medical error, which we discussed a few times ago, firearms, sexual behavior, vehicle accidents, illicit drugs, and so forth. We can begin to think about the causes of death in a completely different way than we've been thinking about the course so far. And in fact, these risks of death on the right account for nearly 1.3 million deaths in 2002, or about 50% of the total deaths in our society. And these estimates here have been generated as much as possible to isolate the pure effect of each cause. So for example, these causes can have additive or even synergistic effects. So being obese and alcoholic is multiplicatively worse for you, okay? So we're not double counting people. We're trying to isolate as near as possible how many deaths are due to lack of exercise or firearms, for example. You can be overweight and be shot. You get counted, half and half, let's say, across the two categories. And in fact, these exposures have multifarious ways of killing us. Tobacco causes not just lung cancer, as is commonly known, but also head and neck cancer, esophageal cancer, even bladder cancer, because your urine concentrates the toxins that are in the tobacco smoke and exposes your bladder and can kill you that way. And also deaths by coronary artery disease and premature births, if your mom smoked while you were pregnant, and neonatal deaths, and COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and pneumonia, and burns. In fact, 3,000 people die every year in the United States simply from inhaling the smoke that other people exhale. So smoking kills many ways, many different ways, and can kind of route itself into some other kind of diseases. And there's a similar story to be told by diet and exercise. Suboptimal levels can cause cardiovascular disease, certain kinds of cancer, diabetes, and so forth. Alcohol consumption can contribute to liver disease, motor vehicle accidents, digestive diseases, and cancer, and so forth and so on. Now, the reason it's important is that changing how we see the causes of death from the left-hand side to the right-hand side actually can affect public policy. We spend about $900 billion on healthcare every year, but less than 5% is spent on prevention, is spent on addressing the causes as seen on the right-hand side rather than on the, less than 5% is spent addressing the causes as seen on the right-hand side compared to as seeing the causes of death on the left-hand side. Now today we're going to be discussing obesity and exercise and diet, and next time we're going to take up smoking and firearms. So let's get a handle on what various body mass indexes indicate. A body mass index is your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. And it's a convenient way of accounting for whether you're obese or not, taking into account how tall you are. And so you can look at different body sizes. So here's a woman with, all of these women have a height of 5.6. Here's what she looks like at 124, and her BMI is 20. Her BMI is 23, 25. This would be now beginning to be overweight, according to current standards. And then here now she would begin to be seen as obese, above a BMI of 30. And here's a BMI of 35 and a BMI of 40, which is considered to be actually morbidly obese. So if you're 5'6" and you weigh 248, your risks of ill health are very significantly increased. And for the guys, this is what it looks like. Apparently long shorts are in fashion. Here he is here, a 6'1" guy, 151 pounds. Here now he crosses the threshold to overweight. Here he's 227. Notice that he's not getting big pecs or anything like that. Here he is now 265, and at 300 pounds, not a football player, kind of muscular guy. That's kind of what he looks like. Now, ordinarily I would dwell on those slides longer, but we don't have time today. Now, this slide shows the percentage of people in the United States who are actually obese, whose BMI is above 30 by sex and race and by time period. So, for example, using different data sets that collected at different time intervals in the early 70s to the sort of early 2000s, 13.9% of white women are obese and 11.9% of white men. Black women, even almost 40 years ago, already had significantly higher rates of obesity, 28.5% and 14.9%. And if you come forward, you see that now amongst white women, or even 10 years ago, it's even more now, 30.6% of white women were obese and 27.5% of white men. Amongst black women, almost half of them are considered obese by clinical standards. Black men, about a quarter, and Mexican men and women, for whom we started collecting statistics more recently, have these high rates. These are not overweight people. This is obese. This is a BMI above 30. This is a kind of a relatively high threshold for considering someone to have excess adiposity. And in fact, there's variation across gender, across race and ethnicity, and across time. Men in general are less likely to be obese than women. Whites are less likely to be obese than blacks and Mexican Americans. And in fact, the obesity rates, as you can see, increase over time, and in fact have doubled since 1970. And nowadays, fully 2/3 of Americans are overweight or obese. Or seen another way, you can look at the average BMI statistics. So now not the fraction obese, just look at the averages of BMI. The average BMI in whites has gone up by 3 percentage points. And in blacks, the average African-American woman has a BMI that's in the obese range. And for black men, it's beginning to approach that, as it is for white men and white women. And these are old data, but they illustrate the point that I'd like to make, which is that the distribution has been constantly shifting to the right. So if we keep as fixed thresholds, picking up on some of the ideas we discussed earlier in the course of like the statistical, the normative, and the adaptive standard for weight, assuming we just pick a statistical standard and just keep it steady. So we say, okay, if you're overweight, that's in a BMI above 25. If it's a BMI above 30, if you're obese, here's a distribution in 1988. Here's a distribution in 1999. This was projected when this paper was published. We've actually met that expectation. The peak of the distribution is now in the overweight range. There's an ongoing shift to the right, incidentally not dissimilar than the smooth shifts that we saw a few lectures ago in hypertension decreasing. So across the whole distribution of human beings, it's not like one category of people is getting obese or losing weight and deforming the distribution. The whole distribution is smoothly moving towards the right as time goes by. And in fact, people are getting so big that hospitals are having to make all kinds of adjustments. Chairs, hoists, special CT scanners, and gurneys. Drug doses need to be adjusted. When I was in medical school, we were taught standard doses for drugs, but as people get bigger, we need to think about different doses. We need to train medical students in a different way. Different doses of medications are needed. In fact, even the needles, since I've gotten in medical school, have gotten longer. When you used to open up the drawer to give a patient an injection, there'd be little needles. Now people are so big, they have so heavy. You know what I'm talking about. When you open up the drawer, they have the needles are bigger because you have to go through bigger layers. She's a doctor. I'm not pointing her for body size issues. That's Lucy, who's one of the TFs. And here you see two nurses on the left sitting in a chair that's meant for an overweight hospital patient, for example, as shown in the woman on the right. Now, this woman on the right is truly extremely large. Her body weight is probably 500 or maybe even 600 pounds. And in fact, every year there are thousands of workplace injuries in hospital workers just from moving overweight patients from place to place within the hospital. Now, I'd like to spend a little time exploring some of the individual level and population level correlates of obesity beyond gender and race and ethnicity. Here on the x-axis is something known as the poverty-income ratio, which you can take to be some kind of measure of wealth or income, and it's a standardized measure of income. And the y-axis is obesity. And now we have different relationships across time. So for example, this is the earliest period in blue, and what it says is that as people get richer, they get lighter in 1971. So for example, the wealthier you are, the thinner you are in 1971 in this period of time. And the next period of time, roughly the same curve. So 5 or 6 years later, you get the same curve. But sometime in the late 1970s, the curve shifts up, okay? And so now the curve is displaced up and still displaced up. So there are 2 points in this slide. First, that the richer you are, the thinner you are. And this is amongst women, white women. And second, that the set point of the curve has been moving upwards across time, such that in the year 2000, a rich woman in the year 2000, if you kind of drew a line, let's say across 27 there, would be almost as heavy as a poor woman in 1971. You see, the richest people now are becoming like the poorest people were in terms of body size 30 or 40 years ago. So, and there's this big leap appears to have occurred sometime in the early 1980s. And this is another way to appreciate that we are in the midst of an epidemic that is affecting all sectors of society. Men and women, black and white, rich and poor, everyone is being affected by the obesity epidemic. The distribution is moving smoothly and across the entire span of the distribution to the right that we saw earlier. Although in men, the curves are flatter, so if not flat. So here's what's happening amongst white men in this situation. The story's a little bit different in black men, but everyone is gaining weight. So the curves are flatter in the sense of the income to BMI relationship, but the set points of the curves are rising in white men, just they are like a rising in white women. Well, how might wealth and weight be related? As usual, the relationship can go one way, both ways, or some third way, or all of the above. So it might be the case that income contributes to weight status. Resources might enable a better diet or leisure time or places for exercise or some kind of feeling of self-efficacy. There could be variations in aesthetic norms and expectations across income levels or racial groups, as you saw in your readings. Or conversely, weight status could contribute to income. There could be labor and marriage market performance variations. So overweight people might be discriminated against in the workplace. They are discriminated against, and they could be paid less money, and that might be what's causing poor people to earn less money. So it's poor people to be fatter. So it could be that a higher weight is contributing to low earnings rather than low earnings contributing to higher weight. Or there could be some common factor, such as personality traits or genes, for example, that's simultaneously causing both income and weight status. Well, here's some suggestive evidence that the relationship can indeed go from body mass index, from weight, to income. This slide shows the effect of being overweight in adolescence on subsequent socioeconomic characteristics among men. And the data come from a nationally representative sample of over 10,000 people who were randomly selected. They were between 16 and 24 years old in 1981. And then they were followed up in 1988. And the characteristics of the subjects who had been overweight in 1981 were compared to those for young people with asthma, musculoskeletal abnormalities, and other chronic conditions. So how do overweight adolescents compare to adolescents that have other diseases or conditions like asthma or musculoskeletal conditions? And it turns out, so if you look here, so this is the comparing the overweight, the fraction, for example, who were married. Amongst overweight individuals, 40% were married compared to 48% of non-overweight. So being overweight reduces your risk of being able to enter into marriage, and there's, there are a lot of socioeconomic consequences. It reduces your income by about $5,000, increases the probability of being below the poverty level, reduces by about half a year to a year the number of years of education you complete, halves the probability that you'll complete college, and does not hugely, but nevertheless detectably decreases your self-esteem for however many years, 8 years later. And what's interestingly in this particular slide, among a number of things, is that at least in the 1980s, there doesn't seem to be much effect on self-esteem. So overweight people are suffering these long-term consequences, these socioeconomic consequences from being overweight, as documented in this study of a random sample of Americans. But in terms of their self-esteem, in this period of time, beginning in the 1980s, there doesn't seem to be a relationship between having a bigger body size and feeling worse about yourself. And these were contrasted in this study, and I can't remember if we assigned this in the readings, were contrasted in this study to other things that might have affected you which didn't have the same effect. So, for instance, if you looked at adolescents with asthma or musculoskeletal conditions, those did not compromise your ability to achieve these outcomes in the same way that being obese did. And the self-esteem finding is actually interesting as far as I'm concerned. Because, for example, as overweight men tend to tolerate their being overweight, their own weight, quite well. And in fact, it turns out that there's a notable lack of correspondence between self-assessed and objective weight status in men and women alike. So here is a medical standard, some kind of objective standard, some kind of statistical or adaptive standard of weight. You could be overweight, normal, or underweight. And here's a kind of self-evaluation of weight status, or maybe some kind of socially constructed, like your own opinion about what counts as overweight or not. So do you think you're overweight just right or underweight in a sample of 41,000 people? And what we found in this study is that if you look at the diagonal elements, these are people who are clinically overweight, who think they're overweight, clinically normal, who think they're normal, underweight, who think they're underweight. And you can see that there's a whole lot of shaking going on. So for example, these are people who are overweight according to the medical standard, but 12% of them think that they're just right. There's not a problem with them. In fact, some small fraction think that they're underweight. And conversely, here are people who are underweight by medical standards, and some small fraction of them think they're overweight, and some other number who are normal think they're overweight, the sort of worried well, as it were. And so people's perceptions of their own bodies and their weight size don't necessarily correspond in either direction to their actual kind of more objective evaluation. And the discordance of self-evaluation with respect to medical standards, however, this mismatch between your own perceptions of yourself and the medical perceptions, as shown overall in the whole sample of 40,000 people in this slide, this mismatch was not homogeneously distributed within the population. For example, compared to men, women are almost 5 times more likely to overassess their body size. So a woman is much more likely than a man to misjudge how big she is and think she's bigger than she actually is. And those that are young, white, wealthier, and are more educated are also more likely to overassess their weight size. And in fact, norms regarding acceptable body size and body types are socially patterned. That is, it is not just weight that can vary by socioeconomic status, but ideas about weight that can vary by socioeconomic status as well. And in fact, being overweight or obese increases the risk of death by about 31%. And this slide, which is taken from your readings, shows the years of life gained by being active compared to being sedentary. Now, those are not a perfect match. Being active doesn't necessarily mean you're thin, but we're kind of folding together here your weight status and the various behaviors that contribute to your weight status, such as your eating behaviors or your exercise behaviors. So this shows the added life from an active lifestyle in men up to the age of 80, estimated from Harvard alumni mortality. So people like you 50 years ago in this university. And what it shows is that this is I can't read this thing. Age at entry. It shows that the adjusted years of life gained from being active over the course of a lifespan is nearly 2 years of life. So being active can add about 2 years to your life. Now, what's interesting, however, about this slide is that, which shows the harms of not exercising, is that there was an interesting exchange in the New England Journal after this paper was published. So they tried to quantify, well, what's the difference between a sedentary lifestyle and an active lifestyle? And they quantified that a sedentary lifestyle was climbing less than 20 flights of stairs per week, or 3 flights of stairs a day. So if you climb less than 3 flights of stairs a day, that increases your risk of death by about 23% over the course of your lifespan. So very minimal amounts of extra exercise every single day can lengthen your lifespan by some amount. But what was very interesting about this study is when that amount was quantified, it found that you lived about an extra 3 months if you walked an extra 3 flights of stairs a day. And someone wrote in and they said, well, if you assume that it takes about 60 seconds to walk 3 flights of stairs and you add it up over the course of your life, it's true that you do live an extra 3 months, but you spend it climbing stairs. But nevertheless, it gives you a feel for the kind of effect size that we are contemplating. So the thing I want you to understand is that while there's some debate, and there's actually some active debate right now in the literature about whether or not being overweight or obese actually harms you, and how it harms you, and who it harms, I think we need to grant that the current state of science, at least as of now, is that it is harmful. So there's still some debate about where the cut points are and which groups at which age are harmed the most and so forth. But I don't want you to leave this talk thinking that actually it doesn't matter, that it's not either individually significant, clinically speaking, or from a public health point of view, that body size or weight isn't important. Some very recent work suggests that there's some subtlety here in terms of whether and how overweight and obesity per se raise the risk of death. And it depends on whether you are merely overweight or properly obese, or how obese you are, or what cause of death we're speaking about, and how old you are, and so forth. For example, obesity appears to raise the risk of death primarily through its effect on cardiovascular disease. And the risk may only rise substantially when your BMI is above 30, according to this recent work. Nevertheless, obesity has a discernible, obesity tends not to have a discernible effect on cancers. So here shows the relative risk of cause-specific mortality by BMI, and this looks amongst 25 to 59-year-olds and 60 to 69-year-olds. According to how big you are, how does that affect your risk of cardiovascular disease during follow-up? And the bigger you are, the more likely you are to die of cardiovascular disease. And there appears to be an inflection point right here around when your BMI crosses 30. These 2 points are much higher than this point. This point is much less, but it could be because these people are very emaciated and have some other disease pathology going on, so that's sort of an artifact. And similarly, you've got a somewhat smoother line, but nevertheless increasing, roughly monotonically increasing probability of death from cardiovascular disease amongst 25 to 69-year-olds according to BMI. Cancer, not so much. So it's kind of flat, these lines. The bigger you are, it doesn't necessarily increase your risk of dying of cancer. And moreover, it's important to understand that even if obesity doesn't kill you, it can be very bad for your health in other ways short of death. So how we quantify health here affects how we think about the problem. It may, in fact, I don't think it is, but it may prove to be the case, unlikely, but possible, that obesity doesn't actually increase your risk of death. But even if it didn't have that effect, it can do all other kinds of badness for you and for our public health system in the interval. So it can affect your disability rates, for example. So in fact, obesity is not just an individual problem, but a public health problem as well. And at a population level, a body mass index of 30 results in a loss of about 3 months of life expectancy at birth, and a body mass index of 35 in a loss of a year of life expectancy at birth in the United States population in 2000. And this public health aspect of obesity in turn raises our usual concern about how to understand the problem, from a collective point of view or an individual point of view, in terms of structure or agency or both. And it turns out that numerous environmental factors are important in explaining the obesity epidemic in our society. What's been happening in our society in the last 40 years that might explain why we have such a manifest skyrocketing level of obesity? Well, there's been a change in social norms. We've already seen some evidence of that in the talk today and in your readings. People think differently about different body sizes. We may have even crossed a kind of tipping point where it becomes normative to have different body sizes than you think. We've had a transition to sedentary and a service sector economy. We don't work with our hands as much. We use labor-saving devices more. We have more sedentary entertainment options. All of those of you playing Game Boy, or not Game Boy, you use other things now. PlayStation or whatever it is, Xbox, you're not out there, exercising. We rely on motorized transportation. We have the design of our cities is different. We've got suburbanization and sprawl, so we don't walk as much. Food is cheaper, and so we buy more of it. There's increased portion sizes, food advertising, and fast food available. And there are other kinds of social changes, like working mothers. So mom is less likely to be home and cooking fresh food, for example. Or a decline in smoking. We've had a decline in smoking. When you smoke, you're thinner. Maybe that's been contributing to the rise in weight gain in our society. But what's important to understand is that our genes themselves are not changing. So it cannot be the case that our genetic, what? It cannot be the case that it's our genetic constitution that's a change in our genes that's causing the change in obesity. It can be, as we'll discuss in a few lectures, an interactions between genes and the environment, but genes are not the cause of the obesity epidemic. And some hint of the role of social norms and environmental factors can be seen by the geographic patterning of the obesity epidemic. So, for example, here is amongst males and females in 1990, the percentage of state inhabitants who are obese. Here is in 1990. Here's 10 years later. You've got like the obesity belt here in the South, for example, although it's also a strike in California. And then you've got all these other individuals that are well, but you've got like Mississippi was sort of, amongst men is, really a trailblazer here. But amongst women, it's kind of a more broad epidemic. And the fact that there's this geographic patterning suggests that maybe there's small area variation in how people see different body size or other sorts of factors. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that norms are indeed changing. In fact, in 1985, 55% of US adults said they found overweight people less attractive than other people, and in 2005, only 24% said so. So there is a change in how we see body size in our society. And social norms are changing to the point where there are even action-oriented organizations, for example, the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, that frames its claims in terms of civil rights. For example, here are some photos from clicking on the URL for the 2005 NAFA convention. So if you go to the website and you click on a URL for their convention, and here's the convention for the National Association for the Advancement of Fat Acceptance that even has a fashion show and so forth. Now, this is a very complicated phenomenon, isn't it? Because we're strongly opposed, or should be, to discrimination and hatred and victim blaming on the one hand, and we should be mindful of our common humanity. I mean, we're all human beings. We all are living in this environment. It's affecting all of us across the whole distribution, as we saw. And on the other hand, however, this change in social norms, in my judgment, is very harmful to public health. How can it be a good thing to glorify this state of affairs? It's very confusing. How do we strike the balance between kind of being empathetic and stressing, our common humanity, and not being discriminatory on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, having a very frank conversation about what it means for our society to have this radical, manifest epidemic in very large individuals, and not just very large individuals, but a stretch across the whole distribution. And in fact, a number of people have been exploring the causes, in addition to the changes in the social norms, which I've been talking about, other changes that may explain the obesity epidemic. Some people have even contended that it's the plentiful supply of excess calories produced by the food industry with government policies that encourage it through agricultural subsidies that may be partially the cause. So the question here is, why does a salad cost more than a Big Mac? Well, if you look at federal subsidies for food production, you see that actually our subsidies go heavily towards those things which are very caloric. We, whether you realize it or not, have a policy which make it much cheaper to buy obesogenic foods, fat-causing foods, than we have policies to encourage the production of healthier foods. So right now we have policies, laws, and other policies which are contributing to us gaining weight. And these policies and laws are mismatched to the government's own nutrition recommendations. You would think that we would tax foods and subsidize them in a fashion which was commensurate with our vision of what healthy eating constitutes. And in fact, these types of effects are not trivial. Even a slight increase or decrease in the average calorie intake can have huge population-level effects. So this slide shows the current rate of excess energy stored by young people, roughly your age, 20 to 40-year-olds in the United States. So here's the amount of excess energy people are consuming, and the median amount of excess energy is about 15 calories. These kilocalories here, it's calories in the way you guys think about it. And at the 90th percentile, it's about 50 calories. So in fact, all we would need to do is if we had an intervention that somehow reduced people's consumption by about 50 calories a day, which corresponds to less than half a candy bar. If we could get Americans to eat just a little bit less, just a tiny bit less, like half a candy bar less per day, we could literally have a radical impact, perhaps even efface or wipe out the obesity epidemic in our society. In short, the obesity epidemic arises from the consumption of a tiny amount of extra food by every person every day, on average, across the whole distribution. So it's not just a few people that are eating a ton out there, it's every one of us is eating a little bit too much. And portion size is also a problem. This shows a change in portion sizes across the last 50 years or so. So 1954, here's a Burger King hamburger, and here it is what it is today. 1955, here's a McDonald's fries, and here's what it is today. Here's a Hershey's bar 100 years ago, and here's what it is today. Here's a Coke in 1916, and here's what it is today. And here's movie popcorn. I remember this change, although I wasn't alive in the 1950s, but it's just unbelievable. That is 1,700 calories of popcorn in that popcorn thing, and it's easy for one or two people to consume the whole bucket while they're sitting there watching a movie. And in fact, there are varying kinds of interventions we might begin to think about if we wanted to respond to this problem in our society. Changes we could make at both the individual and the collective level. So let's spend the rest of the class talking about what might we do from a public policy point of view to make things better. Well, there are things we can do at the intrapersonal level within human beings, things like motivational and skills interventions, or things at the interpersonal level, targeting social norms and networks, how we judge and interact with each other. We'll come back and talk about networks in a few lectures. Or things in the organizational and environmental levels, things at schools, workplaces, or hospitals. Or at the community level, structural changes or advocacy we can engage in. Or at the policy level with respect to laws and regulations. And in fact, things can change. Just look at the decline in smoking we have seen over the last few years. 45% of adults were smokers in 1965, and less than 23% are now. And there's been a cultural shift in our attitudes about smoking. Our norms, our attitudes about smoking have changed significantly. Or look at the changes in sexual behaviors prompted by the AIDS epidemic. Or, frankly, the fact that there are condoms in every laundry room at Harvard. So, this was a change in norms about the use of a public health thing like condoms, for example. And at FOHO, I know they just disappear very rapidly. Or go to the laundry room and they're all gone within a few days. Or the fact that drunk driving laws are working to some extent. 30% of crashes in 1982 involved a drunk driver, and 17% just 20 years later involved a drunk driver. Our attitudes towards drinking while you drive have changed dramatically, and our reactions to it have changed as well. And in fact, many laws have been passed or are under consideration to combat the obesity epidemic by focusing on schools, including restricting access to sodas and other high-calorie, low-nutritive foods. Here's a typical kind of lunch area in a school. And as an appropriate target is school lunches, and not just because they are lousy. Who can tell me what these meals are? You guys recognize these meals? Beige. They're beige. Who can recognize these meals? Raise your hands if these look familiar, these meals. Okay, so many of you went to public high schools or private schools, probably serve the same kind of thing. So what's this here? Who knows what this is? Yeah, I think those are some kind of chicken tenders, and that looks like a biscuit there, and some kind of a soup. Here we've got like a hamburger and French fries. Here's spaghetti and a meat sauce, some bread. There's an orange. I think that's the only healthy thing on this whole. No, there's a peach. And so forth. You can kind of see these green beans look like they weren't eaten on this day, and so they're being served on this day. Okay, who can tell me, on the other hand, what this is? Who knows what these are? These are school lunches in Japan. Who recognizes the food items here? There we go. Yeah, what are these things? What's that?
Like fish and vegetables.
Yeah, fish and vegetables.
And you have rice.
And there's some rice. Yeah. And you can see this is a completely different, kind of lunch that's served to Japanese children in their schools, and frankly, it's much healthier. Or we can have a variety of laws that we pass that are with respect to schools that can be quite effective. And I think this is taken from your reading. This is state legislative initiatives to combat obesity in schools just in a 7-year window from 1998 to 2005. So this is the number of pieces of legislation that were enacted, pending, or introduced. There's laws regarding physical education requirements and funding, nutrition education requirements and funding, vending machine restrictions, which I think is a very rational structural change to make. Coca-Cola company deliberately, they have a philosophy which is within an arm's length of desire. Sort of an interesting idea. So as soon as you think about you want a Coke, very quickly you can get one. In fact, I remember when I was an addict to Diet Coke until about 30 days ago. I'm now on day 30 of sobriety, of Diet Coke sobriety. Thank you. But it was getting ridiculous. I was drinking like 10 Diet Cokes a day, and I have been for like 20 years. And there's so much wrong with that, I can't even go into it right now. We don't have time. But when I would go on business trips abroad, like I would go to England, for example, a British hospital, if you want a Diet Coke in a British hospital, it's not easy to get. Tea, you can get very easily. A Diet Coke is hard to get, but here in the United States, like on every floor of every building, there are Diet Cokes. They're very easy to get access to. Nutrition standards for cafeteria food, outreach to parents, or other efforts to promote the healthy school environment. So the law, in fact, can be a very effective tool in improving public health, as we will see next time to a greater extent when we talk about smoking. But laws have also been used to reduce our exposure to toxic lead in our environment, have improved car safety and reduced motor vehicle accidents, have increased vaccination rates, and have reduced occupational fatalities. So laws can save lives and improve public health, and are one of the several powerful tools at our disposal to try to move the health of the public in a good way. And in fact, legislative efforts have also focused on the community level. In fact, there was a bill filed in 2008 in the Mississippi State Legislature, apparently because the legislature was motivated by its first-in-the-nation status of obesity. And it was, quote, an act to prohibit certain food establishments from serving food to any person who is obese, based on criteria prescribed by the State Department of Health. And I'll leave it for you to discuss in section whether you think this is going too far, and also to talk about Mayor Bloomberg's recent initiative in New York City, a kind of structure versus agency debate, which is, I think, worth having. And sometimes legal interventions have even fostered so-called counter-marketing campaigns, as shown here. So, for example, here's you can require or mandate or spend money on ads like this that say childhood obesity, don't take it lightly. Unfortunately, it's being swamped by the marketing campaign by other companies. McDonald's, my kind of shopping spree. So she has 2 big bags of food that she's happy to carry with her. And in fact, the documentary, I don't know, some of you, which of you saw Super Size Me? Yeah, it's amazing, most of you. That documentary illustrates how effective a strategy we're going to be also discussing next time, known as counter-marketing, can be in changing public health perceptions and improving the health of the public. In fact, this movie premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January of 2004, and less than 2 months later, McDonald's announced that it would no longer sell any of their menu items in the super size, although they officially denied that this move was in response to the movie. I don't know if you remember in the movie, the guy decides to only eat McDonald's food for 3 meals a day for 30 days. If the person that's selling him the food offers him, would you like to supersize that, sir? He says he must say yes according to his self-imposed rules, Most of the time, in fact, the clerk at the store says, "Would you like to supersize that?" He says yes. It's very comedic, and he consumes a huge amount of food. And over the course of the movie, his liver begins to get bigger. He becomes sort of impotent. He has a number of serious problems that arise from his consumption of this level of food. And then he has a very dramatic, I don't know if you remember this, scene in which he puts various McDonald's products under bell jars to see how long they take to rot. And the thing that left such a visual impression on me is that the French fries basically never change. Who of you have been asked by your parents to clean out the family car? Yes. Raise your hands. My God, not enough of you have been cleaning your family car? That's horrible. Where's Dan? Have you cleaned the family car? Okay, when you clean the family car, have you ever found French fries in the bottom of the family car? Raise your hands. Isn't that weird? And did they look any different than the day you purchased them? No, and God knows how long they'd been in the family car. So there are other kinds of ways we can engage in, and so that image is a very powerful counter-marketing image. If you have an image in your mind of a French fry that never, what's the word? Not dissolves. Decomposes, yeah. That's a powerful image to say, why am I eating this thing that, actually has been treated in such a fashion that it could never decompose? And there are other kinds of strategies that can be used in this sort of counter-marketing vein. For example, we can begin to disseminate images like this. Okay, now that's a powerful visual image. I bet you'll remember that tonight, maybe in your dreams. And it tends to subvert our kind of notion about what is appropriate or isn't appropriate food. So we're going to consider counter-marketing in detail the next time. Here's another very effective example of counter-marketing that I really liked. It's an ad for condoms. Don't Be Stupid brand of condoms. And this guy here doesn't have the proper equipment for the challenge that he's facing. So I'm going to leave you with one last thing. Let me just plug it in. So Greg, I changed my mind actually. I do have a video with some sound that I'd like to play. I hope he's up there. And let me just see if I can leave this with you. Okay, so just to see, there's another, what I think is a very effective counter-marketing campaign for a completely different public health problem. It was making the rounds recently.
Set fire to your hair, poke a stick at a grizzly bear.
Turn it up.
Eat medicine that's out of date. Use your private parts as piranha bait. Dumb ways to die, so many dumb ways to die. Dumb ways to die, so many dumb ways to die. Get your toast out with a fork. Do your own electrical work. Teach yourself how to fly. Eat a 2-week-old unrefrigerated pie. Dumb ways to die. So many dumb ways to die. Dumb ways to die. So many dumb ways to die. Invite a psycho killer inside. Scratch a drug dealer's brand new ride. Take your helmet off in outer space. Use a clothes dryer as a hiding place. Dumb ways to die. So many dumb ways to die. Dumb ways to die. So many dumb ways to die. Keep a rattlesnake as a pet. Sell both your kidneys on the internet.
Sell both your kidneys.
Eat a tube of super glue. I wonder, what's this red button do? Dumb ways to die. So many dumb ways to die. Dumb ways to die. So many
Okay, here comes the kicker now.
ways to die. Dress up like a
not yet.
moose during hunting season. Disturb a nest of wasps for no good reason. Stand on the edge of a train station platform. Drive around the boom gates at a level crossing. Run across the tracks between the platforms. They may not rhyme, but they're quite possibly the dumbest ways to die.
So that was the kicker.
Dumbest ways to die. Dumbest ways to die. So many dumb ways to die.
Be safe around trains. A message from Metro.
All right. See you next time.